So, Matt, why don't you tell us a little bit about what that dispute, because that's a bit of a, that's not culturally relevant in the same way anymore, although some of the underlying issues are. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what that was about and how it informs current theological differences?
One way of thinking about it is it became clear in the 18th and 19th century in particular, that the world had changed in some quite fundamental ways. The birth of the modern university over the 18th and 19th century, the development in natural science, but not just natural science, also in history and philosophy and sociology, had meant that some of the fundamental, not just the facts we knew about the world, but fundamental ways in which we constructed knowledge and went about making sense of the world had fundamentally shifted. So, natural science moves along, and all of a sudden, some of the literalist readings of scripture are now fundamentally at odds with other human ways of knowing the world that we rely on every day of our lives. That's the other thing that's tricky, is it's not just that science comes along, it's that we actually live in a world that's constructed by the knowledge we've gained through natural science. So you can't just easily jettison some claims about natural science and then accept others to operate your stove and your TV and your smartphone, and then on the other hand turn around and say, well, it's wrong when I disagree with it, but it's right when I want to have modern conveniences. And then at the same time, and in some ways more critically, the study of history changed quite significantly, particularly as it was applied to scripture. So you start getting these kind of critical historical approaches to the Bible that basically say what in the early days was called higher criticism, which basically says, what if we read the Bible not as a magic book that fell out of the sky, but like any other historical text? And so we want to ask questions like, when this makes a claim, what social, political, economic motivations might lead this text to be written in this particular way? We might ask questions like, what other contemporary sources talk about similar sorts of time periods and events? And do those create conflicts and contradictions, or do they affirm certain things? What archaeological evidence actually supports the claims being made throughout scripture? And so this historical
and so before
approach,
sorry to interrupt, before say the 18th century or whenever, people in the West didn't read the Bible like that.
No, and well, this is the thing that, and this is where the dispute is like a real dispute, right? Because if you ask certain people, they will say scripture wasn't read like that in the early days, so in the medieval and earlier period, because basically everyone just took it literally, and so therefore we have to keep taking it literally. There's another perspective, which is kind of the perspective me and the liberals would make, which is that it's probably fair to say that in the medieval period and before, people didn't read scripture as a sort of, in a critical historical perspective, is the sort of methodology we talk about, as a historical text like other historical texts in line with secular history. But that's not necessarily because they were inherently reading it literally. In fact, if you go back and look at how medieval people read scripture and the early church read scripture, there's a lot of analogy, there's a lot of metaphor, and there's a real ambivalence around the question of, did this literally happen or not? And it just wasn't, it was just a different kind of conversation. So it's true that probably many people in the ancient world in the medieval period basically accepted the Bible as broadly literally true. But it wasn't because they were invested in it being broadly literally true. It's because there were no other well-developed schools of thought, methodologies, and approaches that questioned the literalness, is what I would probably say about that, which is a slightly different, which is a bit of nuance. But it's important to understand when kind of my more conservative sisters and brothers in the faith say, well, all these ancient authors, took the Bible literally. So if you don't take the Bible literally, you're out of step with the tradition. And then I will say, well, there are ways you interpret the scripture that are out of step with the tradition as well. So that's probably not as clear-cut an argument as you might think.
Right. And so what we have is, with the development of the Enlightenment, which includes developments in science as well as thinking about archaeology and reading historical documents, people gradually began to take a more, let's say, historical-critical approach to reading the Bible, or at least some people did. And as well, there were various aspects of the traditional sort of Aristotelian Thomistic worldview, which increasingly came into question, I guess beginning with Galileo, but progressively over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries and into the 19th with evolution and things like that, which, whether they challenge core Christian doctrines or not, certainly challenged aspects of a traditional biblical worldview as it had been understood by many people, let's say, in the Middle Ages. And so that, I think, informs what happened then, as you're talking about later into the 19th century, with this clash between the Modernist and the Fundamentalists.
Yeah, that's right. And here I want to, and this is maybe not so much a historical, well, it's a bit historical, but it's sort of maybe meta history or something. There's a great German theologian, as there are many great German theologians, and biblical scholar called Rudolf Bultmann. He's very famous for a project he called demythologizing, which he meant in a very particular way. And one of the things he makes it, he highlights a distinction which exists in German but doesn't get translated a lot into English, is the distinction between what he calls a world picture or a Weltbild and a world view, or what he calls a Weltanschauung in German. And this is one of those distinctions that I think is helpful for constructing the typology of how we develop these different kind of theological camps in the sort of 19th, 20th, and into the 21st century. So when he talks about a world picture, he's talking about the sort of unconscious cultural frame that we all inhabit. So the sort of like pre-conscious gut feelings about what is and isn't plausible. So the easiest way to understand this is most modern, particularly at least in the West, most modern Western people kind of think of the world as a giant machine, whether like at a tacit level, like it's a sort of system of causes and effects that are related in kind of complex ways. There's probably more nuance to be said about that, but there's sort of this idea that, if I go to turn my car on and it's broken, it's because there's something wrong with a mechanism, with a predictable structure that I can intervene with and manipulate in some sort of way. Whereas in much of the ancient world, particularly in the sort of historical geography of the biblical world, the world is not straightforwardly mechanistic, but it's a domain of spiritual forces that are constantly swirling around and shaping events. And so if you wanted to be successful in your voyage on a ship, then it wasn't just about understanding the mechanisms of the wind and sails and how sailing works and navigation. It was also about offering sacrifices to the gods, because the spiritual forces at play in that journey are just as important as the mechanisms of the world. So at a preconscious level, we have a very different way of understanding the world. And so that's the kind of world picture we inhabit.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt again. I just want to give a little bit of add some meat on the bones to that. So I think this is an underappreciated point, how much the kind of world picture of the average person in the West has shifted in the last few hundred years. In the Roman period, before, as far as I understand it, before every battle, they would take the auspices, which was I don't remember the specifics of that, but I think it involved killing like a chicken or something and then doing something with its entrails to basically tell whether there was going to be a good omen about the battle or something like. Now, I don't know to what extent everyone believed in this, but the point is that was a practice that was done, and it was seen as part of the process by which just you sort of did things, right? Just as every good person in society was expected to make the sacrifices associated with being a Roman citizen to the Roman gods and the pantheon, and many of the emperors were deified after their death and things like that, because that was just how people saw the world, right? Obviously with Christianity, things shifted a bit, but the idea that things were fundamentally spiritual was extremely important to how people saw things. And there was a lot of attention on religious icons, iconography, and people like there was a whole century period of controversy about the status of religious icons and images of Jesus in the Eastern Roman Empire, in the Byzantine period, because people thought they had like real power and real significance beyond what we would just think of it as, well, they're sort of nice symbolic things. And, but it was sort of a different place then. And so the point is that with the rise of the mechanistic worldview, what was originally called a mechanical philosophy, promoted by people like Galileo and later Newton in the 17th century, that began to shift, and people saw things as ultimately the world as a mechanism. Now, what's interesting is that most of these original thinkers thought that God created the mechanism. He set the thing in motion, and that's what many religious people argue today. But what I think is interesting is that wouldn't have been the understanding of most people historically, that God created this intricate kind of mechanism world and then set it going. Rather, that there was a well, I don't want to try to explain exactly how they would have thought about it, but they wouldn't have thought about it like that. And this comes back to the point about the Bultmann quote, which you mentioned. I want to show that again because I think it's I know it's one of your favorites, and it's something that I think is kind of critical to this discussion here. I couldn't find one that didn't have like a cringe backdrop, but anyway, this will do. So we cannot use electric lights and radios, and in the event of illness, avail ourselves of modern medical and clinical means, and at the same time believe in the spirit and wonder world of the New Testament. Might be a bit of a paraphrase, but now what I want to ask you here is just to sort of so that we understand what point he's making here, because I know some Christians take this as saying that you can't be Christian and believe in like science or modern technology at the same time. And that's not quite what he's saying here. As I understand it, he's talking more about the idea of inhabiting different worldviews at the same time and that leading to kind of a dissidence or an issue. So why don't you explicate how you understand that?
Yeah, so that's really helpful. So that quote from Bultmann is like indispensable at some level. One of the other challenges is that a lot of people, I think one of the challenges with this quote is that people read it as normative when Bultmann intends it as descriptive.
Yeah.
So people read it as either saying you can't be a Christian and also believe in modern science, or he's saying that you should, like, that if you're availing yourself of modern medicine and so on, that you shouldn't believe in the sort of worldview of the Bible. He's actually saying something like at one level harsher, but also less remarkable, which is you just can't. Like, even when you say, these people who advocate for the early moderns who are advocating for a mechanistic account of the world, and they still want to have God in the picture. They want to say God is the one who winds the watch, or God is the one who enables the sort of mechanism to work. But fundamentally, that's not a straightforward continuation of how the biblical authors wrote and understood the tradition. And there's a bit of sleight of hand that goes on with some of my more conservative sisters and brothers, where they try to say that they are holding a biblical worldview, but they're doing something in such a different, what Bultmann in the same essay calls a world picture or a cultural framework or a social imaginary that is so alien to the ancient world that you are inevitably doing this sort of translation work to hold, again, this distinction from a world picture and a world view. So Bultmann talks about a world view as a more systematized account of sort of a more developed philosophy of the world. And he says, well, what a lot of these kind of more conservative theological perspectives are kind of doing is they're trying to hold on to the world view while not recognizing that it's a reconstruction or a translation into a very different world picture or a very different cultural moment. And so Bultmann basically is just calling us to a bit of honesty of saying the cultural world we inhabit and that shapes how we view the world at a fundamental level is just alien to the ancient world that these texts come from. And so if we're going to continue to be Christian, which Bultmann is fully in favor of, in fact, he was part of the German Christian resistance. So he was part of the resistance to the German church's complicity with Nazism because of his faith. He is trying to push us into this direction that says holding on to faith in the saving work of Jesus Christ, in the gospel of the Christian tradition, is so important that we need to do it honestly, and we need to do it in a way that takes seriously the world that shapes who we are and the world that we inhabit. And so that's where this kind of gets us to, is you can't live in the modern world and pretend you live in an ancient world. You're actually just kind of deluding yourself at one level. And because it's so important to keep the Christian faith, as Bultmann wants to advocate, we have to work harder than that. We have to think deeper than that to get ourselves anywhere productive.
Yeah. So one way that I think about this quote is, almost anyone who lives in the modern world. Let's say you go into a room and you flick the light switch and the light doesn't come on. Like normally it would, you've been there before, but this time it doesn't. Now, what are the possible reactions you could imagine someone having to that situation? Well, one thing that you could do is you could consult a psychic. You could pray to the gods. You could cut up a chicken and consult its entrails and see what's wrong. You could measure the wind and see which direction it's going and try to work out, like, what do the spirits have in mind about why. Now, these are all examples of things that people used to do in these sort of contexts, about everyday practical matters, about large affairs of state. That was entirely normal and considered just sort of part of life. It was nothing particularly superstitious and nothing particularly out of the ordinary. Of course, some people would have believed it more than others, but it was part of life, right? Now, effectively, no one in the modern world does that. Not even very religious people or very superstitious people or whatever. Pretty much no one would do those things. You would think, oh, the bulb must have blown or something like that. And you would go and fix it, right? And that's a mechanistic explanation about like cause and effect. Now, some people might still believe in those other things, which I might describe as superstition, right? But the point is, in these sorts of examples, when they're interfacing with modern devices, they're not thinking in a sort of a pre-modern worldview. They're thinking in the sort of, let's call it a modernist or post-enlightenment mechanistic worldview, at least in those contexts. And I think what Boltman's calling us to do is be honest about that fact that this is a radical divergence from, let's say, the biblical worldview or world picture, in the sense of the way that the authors of the Bible thought about things. And that then the fact that this is such a radical divergence means that we should seriously rethink about how we understand Christian faith, or how we read the Bible.
Yeah.
And that then informs, I guess, what comes next, which is, okay, well, what do we do with this sort of fact? I think some people try to pretend that this isn't a thing, but I think it sort of is a serious issue. And I think that there's different kind of ways you can go down this. I think that maybe we'll come back to this about